I had a kind of a patchwork career pattern. It was important, and I wanted to do the best job I could. Robert Frank Carroll, born October 25th, 1927. That puts me in my 92nd year, born in Cleveland, Ohio. But my grandparents on my father's side were from Italy, and on my mother's side from Poland and Russia. My dad and mother were both born in Pennsylvania.
He's really young here.
I started my military career by enlisting in the Army when I was 17.
Dad, what are you, other than eating an apple, what were you actually doing?
I was teaching some kind of a subject, but I don't know, some kind of a tactical thing.
And you said you were first stationed where, Dad?
Well, actually, was sworn in Camp Atterbury, Indiana, and then took the train to Arkansas to Camp Joseph T. Robinson. Neither of these camps are still in existence.
And what did you do there?
I took my basic and advanced individual training.
What was that like?
Well, it was a type of training that I was a little bit familiar with because I had served in the Civil Air Patrol in Cleveland when I was in high school.
Oh.
And so I went to an Air Force camp in the summertime at Lockbourne Army Air Force Base. And so I learned how to wear a uniform. I learned how to make a GI bed where a quarter would bounce on it. So I learned those things. So by the time I was in basic training, I was already a tech sergeant in the Civil Air Patrol. So I already had some experience.
So it's not just a myth when you bounce a quarter on a bed. They actually really made you do that.
Oh, absolutely. If you know how to make your bed, you know how to obey orders.
Do you still make your bed that way?
No, I don't bounce quarters on it because I never have a quarter in my pocket.
What year was this? Was this around 1951?
1945.
What prompted you to enter the military? I know you were 17 years old.
Well, I did have an uncle who lived with us, my father's younger brother, who was in World War II in the Ohio 37th Division through the whole Pacific in a field artillery unit in combat. And so I heard a lot about World War II. Of course, I was in high school during World War II, so I was aware of what was going on in the world. And as I mentioned, being a member of the Civil Air Patrol, I used to go on Sundays out to Lost Nation Airport in Willoughby on the Lake, on Lake Erie in Cleveland, and fly missions to see whether there was any strange intruders in Lake Erie. Because there were all kinds of rumors about the Germans, being in small submarines, all over the place. So the Civil Air Patrol actually did patrol these areas. And that it was kind of fun for me. I mean, I was a kid flying in these airplanes. I'm not piloting the airplane, but flying in the airplane. So I was interested. And then going to a couple of summer camps, I learned more about it. And so I really wanted to go in the Air Force. I had already taken, I've forgotten what the equipment was called. It was like a link trainer where you were taught navigation in this link trainer. And I went through that whole course and I really enjoyed it. So I was a freshman in college. I had the opportunity of joining the Navy V-12 program, which would give me an opportunity not to be drafted. There still was a draft going on, and I had to sign up for the draft when I turned 18. And I decided I didn't want to be drafted. I don't know why. So many young people in my neighborhood, had gone to war, and I was not old enough. So I was 17. VJ Day, VE Day, and DJ Day had occurred. VE Day was in August, and in August, and VJ Day was in September. So I enlisted before I was 18. I was 17, about the 15th of October, and my mother had a sign for me because I didn't want to be drafted. So that was the main reason. I don't know of any other explanation.
The uncle that you're talking about, what kind of stories do you remember about World War II that he was saying?
Well, actually, I had a lot of his memorabilia that he had sent to my mother because he lived with us. And I accumulated all of that a few years ago and donated it to the Pacific Museum in South Texas, including one of the more interesting things is he had a jungle knife that the artillery people had a lot of mechanical equipment, to maintain their 155 caliber howitzers. So some of the technicians there were able to take the handle off his jungle knife, cut down the blade so it was almost like a stiletto, take plastic chips and make a new handle, and in the head of the handle, which was a piece of aluminum that was cut out, he had pasted in there a picture of Betty Grable. So when they saw this at this museum, they looked at it as a real treasure. They really complimented me for saving that in the letter they sent to me, thanking me for the stuff. But I had all of his memorabilia, including photos, in his unit, and General Beetler, who was the division commander. This is the Ohio National Guard Division, the 37th Infantry Division. The insignia on the patch that they wore was like a red rising sun, and typical GI slang, as they were called, the flaming assholes, the Buckeyes. And then went from there to Fort Benning, Georgia, when I was selected to go to Officer Candidate School. I was in the last of the Officer Candidate School, OCS Class 539, one of the last. I'm not sure if it was the exact last. Then I was commissioned as a second lieutenant in July 1946. And from there, I was immediately assigned to the 2nd Infantry Division, the Indian Head Patch Division, which is an old infantry division from World War I. Very, very combat trained unit at Fort Lewis, Washington, where I went by train. While at Fort Lewis, Washington, uh, I had some very interesting experiences because young and single, and my buddies were young and single. So we used to drive down to Hollywood, California. This was still close enough to the end of the war where the Hollywood Canteen was still in existence. So we used to go to the Hollywood Canteen and dance with all these beautiful young women that were brought there for us to dance with. So that was a lot of fun. So I enjoyed my tour duty there at Fort Lewis, Washington. So from Fort Lewis, Washington, I went to Korea for the first time. Remember I said this was after the end of World War II, and we're clearing. They had cleared the rest of the Japanese out of there, and South Korea at that time had a very small military force that were still in Japanese-style uniforms. People don't realize this. Remember, Korea is an old historic. So from Fort Lewis, Washington, I went to Korea for the first time. Remember I said this was after the end of World War II, and we're clearing. They had cleared the rest of the Japanese out of there, and South Korea at that time had a very small military force that were still in Japanese-style uniforms. People don't realize this. Remember, Korea is an old historical country, and it predates Japan historically. It was closer to China. The major export of Korea when I was there the first time, you'll never believe it, was, compared to their high-tech industry now, their major export was apples. They were famous for their apples, and that was about it. The Japanese, during their 35-year occupation of Korea, exported everything that Korea had back to Japan. Any of the big Buddhas, like the Buddha Kamakura, was actually cast in Korea. And the Japanese held the Koreans under strong control. Some of it for the Korean well-being, and that is the Koreans, because there were ice-cold winters, never had enough firewood, so they were forever cutting down their woods. And the Japanese had a large reforestation program, and they forced the Koreans to replant seedlings. And if a Korean was caught cutting down a tree without authorization, was killed on the spot. So therefore, historically, there's no great love, Koreans for Japanese, to today. But they get along because they are allies, and because they're our allies. So when I finished that tour, I came back to Fort Dix, New Jersey, to the 9th Infantry Division, where I met my first wife and got married. She was in the service, and I was a unit commander.
Do you have any interesting experiences or stories that you can remember?
I was coming from the 9th Infantry Division in Fort Dix, New Jersey, where I was training recruits. Mm-hmm. By ship, I went to Korea, or actually to Japan. We landed in Japan, and the way assignments were given in those days is you're on the troop ship, and the assignment officer would come aboard the troop ship, and they would call you out by name and say where you're going. Well, the logical place for me to go at that time was the 35th Infantry Division, or the 34th Infantry Division, or the 11th Airborne Division if I was an airborne troop, or the 1st Cavalry Division.
Why was that the logical?
because I was an infantry officer.
Okay.
So, and I was a second lieutenant, so I was prime meat for being a platoon leader. So when they called my name out, Lieutenant Carroll, Sagamo Prison. And my rejoinder was, where's that? What's that? You know, never even heard of it. So it turned out that the assistant prison engineer at the prison had been evacuated that week. So they're looking for somebody with engineering experience. I had a freshman year in mechanical engineering in Cleveland at Case University. And they said, and I was the only officer on the ship that had any engineering experience, even though it really wasn't any. It was only in school. So they assigned me as assistant prison engineer in a prison, and I had never even set foot in a prison before. So it was a small unit. We had about 25 staff officers there. My boss was a captain engineer. The commander of the prison was a full colonel engineer, and I'm sorry, not engineer, a military police. The people assigned there were military police. So as the assistant engineer, I was responsible for all of the operations of the engineering part of running a prison, and the people that actually did the work were Japanese engineers. For example, we had a hydrologist because Sagamo means duck swamp, so the prison was built on a swamp. And there is where we had the war criminals. And that's where Tojo was, Shigemitsu, and that's where they were hung. And I unfortunately had to attend a couple of hangings because as the assistant engineer, I was responsible for emergency electrical equipment for lights, even though the gallows was a hollow building that had no windows. And all the hangings were done after midnight. But that's kind of details, things that I'll never forget, but not necessarily pleasant for other people to hear. Anyway, so that was my experience at Sagamo. Now, when the Korean War started in 1950, I was playing golf at Kogane Golf Course. And when I got back to my quarters, there was a note slipped under my door. It said, report to the headquarters immediately, which I did, and found out that the Korean War had started. So they told me that someone decided that sooner or later we were going to have some prisoners of war, so we better have a unit in Korea. So I activated a company in Camp Zama, Japan. We had some troops from the prison, all military police. In the meantime, I had been detailed into the Corps of Military Police by General MacArthur. It's the only order I had cut in my career, signed by order of General MacArthur. So we went from Camp Zama to Camp Ko, and then got on an LCVP, it's a landing craft vehicular personnel, and went to Korea during the Pusan Perimeter in July of 1950, which meant that the only troops in Korea were right there around Pusan, because the North Koreans were moving down. Sooner or later, we got word, and this was maybe about the second month we were there, that the 35th Infantry Division, one of their regiments, had captured 25 prisoners of war. So I took a little task force with two 2.5-ton trucks and went to pick them up. In the meantime, we had set up an enclosure to have these prisoners, and we went to get them. On the way to getting them, we were fired at, and by the time we got to the regimental headquarters, it had been overrun, but the prisoners were still safe, so we got them on the two trucks and got them back to our little camp. And those were the first prisoners that were captured in the Korean War.
By your regiment.
by an American unit, and then by my company, we picked them up and brought them back. And that was the beginning of United Nations Prisoner of War Camp number 1.
Yes, because in your notes that I see, you were responsible for all logistics operations of the UNPOW camps 1, 2, 3, and 4.
And 5, actually.
And 5.
Yeah.
And that was 1950 to 51, and
That's
you had
right.
35 personnel.
That's right. And at that time, one of the major things that I recall, and anybody who was in Korea at that time, MacArthur had promised that we'd all be home for Christmas of 1950. And I very realistically remember sitting in my Jeep with my Jeep driver, who was from Alabama, saying on Christmas Day 1950, here we are still in Korea. I wonder what happened to that promise.
And you didn't go home.
Didn't go home until 1951, August of 1951.
Were there any interesting moments during this time that you remember, any experiences, good or bad?
Yeah, actually, one of the things, when we started getting more prisoners than we needed, so to speak, we were up to maybe 130,000 prisoners of war, and they at that time were all North Koreans. This is before the Chinese got into the conflict. So it was decided at higher headquarters that we need to evacuate the prisoners to a larger area, preferably off the coast. So it was decided after, well, we had a quartering party, which I was on, looking at a couple of islands. And the island that we picked was Kojido, which was off of Busan. It was a small island, strictly farming, I've forgotten how many square miles it was, but not too many. It was probably around 6 miles in the perimeter around the island. So we took 25 to 30,000 prisoners of war on 2 ships, took them over to the Kojido with barbed wire, concertina, and 2 Republic of Korea military police units that had half-track vehicles with quad 50s. And we set them around as security towers and had the prisoners build the first enclosure around themselves, which was kind of interesting, yeah. So our biggest concern all the time was security, because we didn't have that many Americans there, and the only troops there were Republic of Korea troops. And they weren't performing quite, the way we would like them to perform. So we finally got a couple of military police units in there, American military police units in there, and things tightened up a little bit better. But one interesting thing that happened in the first few months is you had 30, at this time, maybe around 60,000 prisoners of war. They had to go to the bathroom. So we built outdoor privies that were long benches that were elevated where they could sit. And below them were 55-gallon drums. And we tried to teach them not to put the toilet paper in the same 55-gallon drums. So how do you get rid of all this fecal matter? Well, the prisoners of war carried the barrels out to the ocean, which is the Yellow Sea, and dumped it in the Yellow Sea. Well, nobody thought about this, but within a month or a month and a half, instead of a sandbar being out there, there was a fecal bar. Really and truly, and the odor was really bad. Now, these are the kind of things, that you face. People don't think about it, and that's what happened. The one Kojido story that I remembered last night that I wanted to mention yesterday was remember I said the Korean prisoners of war wore old army uniforms, you know, that were brought out from storage in Japan, shipped over to us, and we had them paint PW on the front and back. Somebody had a brilliant idea, and I don't remember who it was. Who it was said, you know, those are kind of tacky. They said, what we need to do is we need to dye these uniforms red and paint PW on them in white. They said it'll look a little more uniform and classy and whatever. Well, so we went. So of course, then they turned to me because I was the logistician, so I had to figure out how to do this. So we got the dye, and we got big barrels, and we had them actually dye the uniforms, and we hung them up on like clotheslines, you know, to dry, and then we painted the PW on them, and then we took only one compound just to see how it worked. So we had them get rid of their old uniforms and put these red, which I did not like. Costumes, not
right.
uniforms, costumes on. The next morning, when we got to that compound, there was this big bonfire in the middle of the compound. They had taken them all off and burned them, the prisoners did. And they were in their skivvies. Fortunately, it was in the summertime, it wasn't in the winter. So the commander at that time was a full colonel of the whole shebang. There was no generals there. He saw the handwriting on the wall and said, forget about that project. He said, don't die anymore. I said, thank you. But that was really funny. And the other, listen, prisoners of war weren't dummies. I mean, they weren't dummies. One day, in the early days before we went to the island, and our first UN POW camp number 1 was on the mainland, which I started activating. One day somebody said, I was a lieutenant, we've got something over here that you really need to see. So we came over, and what happens is when you brought the prisoners in for processing, that was my company, Prisoner of War Escort Guard and Prisoner of War Processing Company. So part of the processing where they issued, I mentioned yesterday, the blankets and, you know, the half a blanket and the rubber shoes and all that stuff. The other thing is you open the front of their clothing and you sprayed them with DDT dust because they all had all kinds of lice and everything, their hair and everything. So they had popped this jacket open on this one prisoner, and there were 2 young women's breasts looking at him. And that's what they wanted me to see. They said, we think this is a girl. I said, it definitely is a girl. I said, let's get her the hell out of here. So we got her over into a separate tent and found out that she was a white Russian. And her name was Sophia. So we notified the Russian embassy in Tokyo and said we captured a woman who we think is a camp follower, and we have her in a separate compound, away from everybody else. And it was a while, but after 2 or 3 weeks, we were able to send her to Japan and turn her over to the Russian embassy. But in the meantime, she had got herself all gussied up somehow. I mean, she'd got some cosmetics and she had lipstick on, and she was looking like a real girl. But she was probably in her 20s.
What was her motivation?
Yeah. We never did find out, other than she had this boyfriend, you know, who brought her with him, you know, with his unit. And she just kind of melted into the background, and it was just like another soldier.
So when you say camp followers, can you define that?
Yeah, these are comfort girls. These are prostitutes, you know, who are available to keep the boys happy. You know, and most of them were given money, you know, paid for by, in this case, the North Korean government. We did have one other occasion where the lieutenant, you need to see this, and I went over, and he said, put your hand in this prisoner's pocket, and I did, and something felt kind of strange. And I pulled it out, and it was a finger. Somebody had cut his finger off and left it in his pocket. So I had a pretty good idea, because we had some Sikh Indian people there during the war, and they had a tendency to cut fingers and ears off to prove, that they had captured these people.
Would they keep them typically, or no? They just
No, they just did it. They just did it. They just did it to leave their mark. No, I don't know whether
Yikes.
that particular one was, but that certainly was the way things happened. We had our doctor look immediately, see if he could reattach it. I mean, you can reattach something, a digit, if you get it quickly. But this was, days and days after he was captured, so it was beyond repair.
Okay, remember when you were telling me about, like, sometimes when you were on the helicopters and or when they were flying?
Yeah.
They tried with the bow and arrow?
Yeah. Actually, I'm trying to remember the names now of the indigenous people who lived in the highlands in near Pleiku, and these individuals used crossbows, and they had been there for I don't know, thousands of years, I guess, historically. And sometimes they would lie on their back, and they knew a lot of American helicopters were flying over their jungle areas, and they would fire the crossbows directly up at the helicopters. And accidentally, even though they were trying to do it, there was no way they could do it precisely, but accidentally, an arrow would get into the rotors of helicopters and down the helicopters. So I remember at least two occasions where some of our helicopters, were down by these indigenous individuals. So wartime is a very interesting place. You never know what's going to happen. There were a lot of women Korean women that became drug addicts. And so they were convicted of committing crimes against the occupation. So they were tried, convicted, and incarcerated in Sagamo prison. And they were treated cold turkey to get rid of their drug addiction. And they really screamed in this.
Because they were going through withdrawals?
Oh yeah, cold turkey.
What are you gonna do?
I don't think it was our decision. It was somebody from higher up
Yeah.
telling our commander what to do,
Yeah.
because this wasn't his nature at all. So that was an experience there. But there were some interesting experiences. One was we had our own hydroponic farm that the Japanese prisoners, war criminals, actually ran. That's where it's done without dirt. You raise vegetables, and they get real big because they get a lot of water. So they grow on pebbles, in troughs. And we had a very, very responsive farm. In fact, I would bring home, every night fresh vegetables and some fruit, that we grew in the farm, because I was under my engineer aegis. No, when I left, remember I left to go to Korea.
Okay.
So the prison was running full bloom then.
Okay.
They still had, I don't know, maybe 10 prisoners on death row. Ultimately, well, yeah, there is another little story. When I got my orders to go to Korea to activate this company and take to Korea, I went in. We had a Japanese admiral there, a one-legged admiral, who was in command of all the naval units in the Japanese Navy. His name was Shigemitsu, Admiral Shigemitsu. And he actually, after the war, was voted in as the first prime minister of Japan. But the day before I was ready to leave for Korea, or actually to Camp Zama to activate this company to take to Korea, I made the rounds to say goodbye to everybody, including Chokyo Rose, but including Admiral Shigemitsu. Now, by this time already, the war had been going on about a month. He already had asked for, and they brought him a big situation map that he had on his cell. Remember, he was a 4-star admiral. So he had pins and marks on there, of what was happening in Korea by then, because he had a radio, so he could hear what was going on. So he knew me. He knew who I was, and I told him what I was doing, and he looked at me very carefully, and his English was very good. And I was a lieutenant. He says, "Lieutenant," he says, "I have some advice for you." I said, "Yes, sir. Tell me." He said, "Don't trust the Koreans." This is coming from a Japanese. I said, "Thank you, sir." And I left. And I said, "What a hypocrite." He actually said that. Yeah, "Don't trust the Koreans." Okay. Of course, he did know I already had a tour in Korea, before.
Yeah.
And I knew what the Japanese did, to the Koreans.
Yeah, you're well aware of what's going on.
Yeah.
That's so
But that was his advice before I went to Korea. Admiral Shigemitsu. The last brigadier general, actually, when I was stationed at Fort Benning, there were a number of young officers whose fathers were generals in World War II that I knew. And some of them went on to become real good, fine officers, generals. Billy Vaughn was one of them, the one who was in Vietnam in my last tour in Vietnam. He was the deputy commanding general of 2 field forces to General Mike Davidson, who was 4 stars.
Billy Vaughn.
Yeah, Billy Vaughn.
Mm-hmm.
Real nice guy,
Yeah.
a real smart guy. Another one was Bill Mundy, who we were captains together, and he ended up being a major general. And he ended up being the chief of the officers assignment branch in Washington. And when I was deciding whether I wanted to stay in the Army and maybe make general, I went to see him, and I said, "Billy, what do you think?" He said, "Well, you got a fine record." He said, "But you need more combat commands." He says, I said, "Well, send me back to Vietnam." And he says, "You've already been there twice?" He says, "No, I can't do that." He said, "Because I can't guarantee you a battalion." He said, "If I could guarantee you a battalion, I'd send you." He said, "But I can't do it because once you get there, somebody may bump you like George Patton Jr., you see." So I respected his judgment, and he ended up being a major general, real smart guy.
So interesting.
So there are a number of them that I knew that were decent and honest and had good values.
Yeah.
And
Colonel, Dad,
I also worked for a few of them that were bad apples.
Yeah.
Oh, I had one of them. I had a battalion commander. I was on his staff. I was his S1. I was his personnel officer. The staff is S1, 2, 3, 4, 5. S1 is the personnel management personnel officer. The S2 is the intelligence officer. The S3 is the operations officer. The S4 is the logistics officer. And the S5 is civil affairs officer.
So like a baseball team.
Yeah, I've been a 1, I've been a 3, and I've been a 4. So I've had a lot
Wow.
of experience. Anyway, I had this battalion commander in Germany. I was his S1. I was a company commander first for him. I had B Company of the 371st Armored Infantry Battalion. Became the S1. He made terrible command decisions. He had terrible relationships with his staff. He wouldn't go home at night because he didn't get along with his wife. And so I would call her and say, because he was just, and we had, the staff had to say, stay as long as he was there
Oh, Lord.
in his office. Oh,
He
yeah.
couldn't go home.
Oh, yeah.
The guy
yeah.
didn't want to go
So
home.
I would call his wife and I'd say, it's time for Colonel Allen. He's finished for the day. Why don't you give him a call? And she would. And I did this quite often. And we were together, on that.
Yeah.
So she'd call him and say, George, it's time to come home. And no, not George. What was his first name? I've even forgotten. His last name was Allen. But anyway, the troops hated him because he had this. We had a line of command board in every headquarters. So who the battalion commander is, S1, 2, pictures. We used to call
Family
it
tree.
the Rogues Alley, thing.
What did you call it?
The Rogues Alley, not
Gallery.
Rogues Alley, Rogues Gallery. And almost once a week, his picture would be missing from the man. The GIs would take it. The other thing they did twice, they put sugar in his gas tank, twice. He didn't get the word, he didn't get the message, that the companies didn't like him, So one time he had said something that was really terrible, and I was standing in front of him, and I guess I was clenching my fist, and he looked up at me and he says, "Are you going to hit me?" And I said, "Not on your dime, Colonel. No way would I hit you. I'd be in jail." No, after Fort Benning, I went to the Commanding General Staff College.
So after Fort Benning, where did you go?
The Army Commanding General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. That was a 12-month course
Okay.
where family and all went. It was a long period of time.
What was that course about?
How to be a staff officer at the higher level, at the division level.
Did you change? Did you get promoted after that?
No. Actually, you had to be at least a field officer. You had to be a major. So our students were either majors or lieutenant colonels. In fact, one of the officers who was in my class was a lieutenant colonel named Bernie Rogers. And when I retired from the Army in 1976, he was the Army Chief of Staff, and I have a nice letter from him congratulating me on finishing my Army career and wishing me good luck in the future.
Oh, that's
Real nice man. 4-star general.
Talk about Kennedy, Dad.
I mean, that's documented, everywhere. I mean, there are all kinds of clips on that. I just happened to be there when they lit the Eternal Fame. I do remember that specifically.
But Charles de Gaulle.
Well, and Charles de Gaulle and Omar Bradley. Bradley was the chief of staff of the Army when MacArthur was the commander there in Tokyo. And actually, MacArthur turned down a visit of Bradley to Tokyo. He didn't want any American generals visiting his headquarters. And senators and congressmen couldn't visit him unless he gave his personal permission. Well, because he ran his country.
Was it for security, maybe?
What?
Was it a security issue or just a?
Oh, no, it was a personal issue. Because his policy and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Omar Bradley, were completely divergent on how to prosecute the war in Korea, which ultimately Truman fired him. Justifiably so, because he didn't do what the President of the United States wanted done.
What's that one story about Nixon, Dad?
Well, I met him at with President Saragat, who was the president of Italy at the time. And Saragat was known to the Italians as a grandfather. And the president of Italy, as compared to the prime minister, is just a figurehead. But he was a nice, gentle, pleasant man. But the tricky part of visiting the Quirinale Palace, which is on a little hill in Rome, and it has a big piece of sculpture that's a small version of the Washington Monument. So it's kind of a stele, very sharp, pointy on top. So our helicopter pilot that was flying Marine One was concerned. So they made a bunch of practice passes obviously without Nixon. And then when came time for him to come in, they brought him in on it. And I had never seen him in person. And when he jumped out of the helicopter, he was a little guy. And he had this great California tan on, and he was very, very ebullient and very interesting. And of course, it took him into the palace for his meeting with Saragat. And then after that, we went directly from, which is why I was there, to take the president and his entourage to Sixth Fleet headquarters in Naples, which we went to by helicopter. We carry Marine One helicopter around on a big airplane.
Did not know that.
Yeah, our president doesn't fly in anybody else's airplanes but our own. There was one, and I told Linda about this, is in the early advisory days in Vietnam, with the experience the French had and ultimately lost at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, that the Western world underestimated the capabilities of the North Vietnamese. I mean, the leaders they had up there knew what they were doing. And they really had the confidence of the Vietnamese people. But at that time, the French had subjugated the Vietnamese army to the extent where they really fought back, and they beat the French. Well, we were involved, I think, even a little bit before Eisenhower, and we, of course, were big supporters of the French. So there was always a lot of political discussion in Washington, getting some input from Vietnam. So our MAG started there with the three-star general who was there when I arrived, General Magar. And he parted his hair right in the middle this way, and you'll never guess what his nickname was. Old Splithead. You know how the GIs are. But it was perfect nickname. But he was a nice guy. He was a nice guy and efficient. But what was happening was there already was discussion on how, now Magar got there, I got there in 1961, and Magar got there like in 58 or 59. So the MAG had been there for a few years already. So there was already talk on what we were going to do. We were going to help, the French, which we did, and then were we going to increase our presence through the MAG? Because the Vietnamese, Ngo Dinh Diem was not a dummy. I mean, he knew that if we stayed there, it would help him. Remember now, he was a Catholic, and the Vietnamese are not Catholic, but there was a large group of Catholics, that in Vietnam through the front because of the French. And they had a beautiful cathedral there in Saigon. So So the discussion started after Nixon became president and Robert Strange McNamara was the Secretary of Defense. McNamara had his smart guys, young guys, working for him, and he was a hawk, but he was a smart hawk.
You're saying he had McNamara.
Yeah, they
Built a
called it,
team?
and his staff were handpicked, and their nickname, they were called the Whiz Kids, because they were brilliant. He had people who worked for him who were really smart, and McNamara was really smart. So the discussion was basically, should we introduce American troops, combat troops, or should we just increase our advisory group, or should we add just special troops? Remember, we had never been in a counterinsurgency war.
Right.
We had a little bit of it in Korea because in the beginning we weren't fighting North Korean soldiers in uniform. We were fighting people in Korean white outfits, so
And
you
the
didn't know who was
technology
shooting
was
at you.
changing at that
Yeah.
point.
So anyway, so to get a decision, the President of the United States and McNamara said we need to have a special emissary to study the situation and give us a recommendation. So they developed a group called the Maxwell Commission, and the Taylor Commission, Maxwell Taylor. So General Maxwell Taylor, who had been the Chief of Staff of the Army, a very highly decorated, respected World War II general, 4 stars, brought his commission to Korea, and I was to Vietnam, and I was there in the headquarters of the MAG. So we hosted the Taylor Commission. At the end of the Taylor Commission, I was at the briefing, and Taylor recommended, without any qualifications, that we not introduce combat troops, that we bring in some special forces units, and that we continue the MAG presence, adding some more advisors. When that got back to Washington, the Hawks really didn't agree with it, and I don't know the because I was in Vietnam, but the story that I heard was that Rumsfeld was influenced so much by the people who wanted to introduce combat troops that he finally got Taylor to walk back some of his recommendations and basically say, well, if you really want to do it, we can justify combat troops. And I also heard the other side of the coin where they said Taylor really didn't want to walk back his recommendations. So I don't know, the real, I wasn't there. I don't know anybody in the meetings. I knew people who were there in the meetings. So I got it secondhand. But that was my understanding of what happened. So the Taylor Commission, from my point of view, was the correct decision, where he said, do not bring combat troops in.
Because what was the result, as we know?
That's right. Well, the French didn't win, and the French had great armies. There's nothing wrong with the French. I mean, and their premier units, lost at Dien Bien Phu. They're parachutists. They were jumpers. So that's how the Vietnam War escalated. When the Washington military-industrial complex, because the military wanted to continue, most of them. You know why? Is because it gives you live bullets training. This is not play games. People are shooting at you and you're shooting back at them, to test new weapons, to test new tactics. I mean, it's good. It's good. Unfortunately, what's the byproduct? Dead Americans. That's the byproduct. Dead indigenous people of the country that you're at war with. So that was a decision, and then it got escalated to thousands. I think we had 200,000 troops there at one point, even more, maybe even more. And we had all kinds of infantry divisions there. We had airborne divisions. We had, all kinds of stuff. So when I got there for my second tour with the 2 Field Forces Command, I mean, we had we had like 4 infantry divisions. We had allies. We had all kinds of stuff going on. Combat operations every place. Helicopters flying all the time. Bombing, incessant bombing of North Vietnam. So it was a poorly decided war. And after the fact, as you all here know, who apologized to the American public and said he made the wrong decision? Robert Strange McNamara.
Right.
Didn't he go a little bananas?
Yeah, he was really, really bummed out
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah, when he finally realized that was all bad. And we lost 58,000 men in Vietnam. 58,000 dead.
I got goosebumps
Yeah.
when I think about that because of that.
And most of them were draftees, young draftees. Yeah.
Have you been to the Vietnam Memorial in Washington?
No,
Oh, it is amazingly touching.
So saying that, 1,000 enemy were killed every day, would be good for the American public consumption.
But that was a lie.
It was a lie, exactly.
It's almost like propaganda.
And you knew it at the time.
Yeah, it was in place. So that was my real take on Vietnam. So I was not a supporter of the Vietnam War at all. I mean, I was there because I'm in the Army and, yes, sir, I obey orders. But I wasn't shooting, killing people, so I don't, and I'm not making any decisions. But the people that were shooting and killing people, there were some of them that said, have some more. One was George Patton's son, General Patton's son, who was a real gung-ho, insisted he wanted to have a battalion command, and I knew him. He was the same class of West Point as my regular Army commission, which I ultimately got. But he didn't do much for me.
at that point, did you know, like when you knew him, that he was the son of General Patton?
Oh, sure, of course.
'Cause-
He tried to be a lot like his father, but he wasn't like his father. George Patton Sr. was really unique. He really was unique. A lot of people loved him, and a lot of people hated him, but it's one of those things, love-hate. But the son was gung-ho and wanted to be in combat and wanted to become a hero and wanted to, and all that kind of stuff. I mean, really, we had a number of particularly lieutenant colonels who were battalion commanders. As they say, you have to get your ticket punched to become a general. I mean, I knew I wasn't going to be a general because I didn't have the right kind of combat commands. If I did, I probably would have.
Really?
But anyway, so when he got there, and Paul Harkins, General Harkins, the one I told you that I knew, was a combat commander. An armor division has 3 combat commands. He was one of the combat command commanders under General George Patton. He was a full colonel at that time, General Harkins. So Harkins was the commander in Vietnam, and here comes George Jr., who knew General Harkins obviously knew George Jr., and he was going to give him whatever he could give him, and he gave him a battalion command. So he bumped somebody else, who wanted it, and Georgie got it.
Yeah, legacy.
Yeah.
Huh.
It's who you know, too,
Yeah.
sometimes.
For sure.
And I guess he was okay, but, he wasn't like his father. I didn't, I knew him because he would come into the headquarters and demand a lot of stuff. And sometimes I just had to filter what he wanted, in a...
What kind of,
the
you must
boss.
have gotten a lot of unique requests from people who felt like him entitled?
Oh, there were some. Yeah, there were some. But I have to say, and I told this to Linda, most of the military officers that I knew and were associated with were decent people. I mean, there weren't that many hawks. There were some hawks, but not that many. Like General Rogers, the guy who I said I was at the Army Command and General Staff College with, who ended up being the Chief of Staff of the Army when I retired, was not a hawk. He was a dove. He was a real nice guy. A Rhodes Scholar, honey, by the
Yeah.
way.
You also mentioned that when you were like going over there that somebody had gotten killed, the one that you were going to replace.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, that was the first tour in,
The first
in
tour,
Vietnam. Yeah. Actually, it was just one of those serendipitous things where I was scheduled to be a regimental advisor to the Vietnamese Army. This was the first tour in Vietnam in 61, 62. And when I arrived there, I was getting my field equipment and my weapons, and I was scheduled to leave the next day on an otter for this regiment. And the Assistant Secretary of the General Staff of the MAG headquarters had come down with some type of illness, and he was evacuated as an emergency evacuee. So they needed a replacement. So they looked to see who had just arrived in country, and that included me. And I had been a Secretary of the General Staff at Fort Jackson, excuse me, South Carolina. So they called me up to the headquarters and said they were offering me this position, and that I want it. So I asked, well, how long was the tour? And they said, well, field tour, if I'd continued with the advisory position in the regiment, that would be 12 months. And if I opted to stay in the headquarters, it would be 13 months. Well, I opted to stay in the headquarters. I found out 2 weeks after I had assumed the Assistant Secretary of the General Staff position in the MAG headquarters, that the officer who then replaced me as a senior advisor, the regiment was going through a sweep in a heavily controlled area by the enemy and got killed. So, but for the grace of God, there go you know what. So it was an interesting experience. I was lucky. There was one other incident that I think was interesting. As the war started getting a little heavier, they decided that the MAG was not fully staffed enough to handle a potential arrival of combat troops, even though it wasn't exactly approved, but they thought it was going to be approved to bring some combat troops in. So they selected a commanding general whose name was General Paul Harkins, four-star general who in World War II was one of George Patton's combat commanders. The weekend that General Harkins arrived in country, I happened to be the duty officer at the MAG, so I was on duty. So I met him at the airport, brought him back, put him in the hotel that we had set up for him, and brought him to the headquarters. So, I'll never forget this because it was really interesting. He said, and who are the senior advisors, in the provinces? And these were all full colonels, and I gave him all the names, and he apparently knew one of them. He said, well, can you contact Colonel so-and-so? And I said, I'll try. I said, but ordinarily, I said, the Vietnamese Army doesn't work on weekends. I said, so therefore our advisors will not be in their respective offices. And he was not happy with this answer. and said, "Don't you know there's a war going on?" I said, "Yes, sir, we know there's a war going on." He said, "Well, effective immediately, all headquarters will be manned 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, 24/7. I said, "Yes, sir, I'll make sure that the staff knows this tomorrow." So anyway, he turned out to be the commanding general of MACV, Military Advisory Group Vietnam. They changed from MAG to MACV, and he was the first commander there.
And then that's very interesting. And then
Yeah, actually, interesting story. When I was in 7th Army Headquarters, in the Personnel Services Division, we had a sports program, and we had a recreation program for other things. So I had two guys, or three civilians that handled the sports programs. Football is a big deal. You know, the Army divisions, our infantry divisions, recruited players in college and in high school that once they entered the service, they came immediately after their basic training to their respective infantry division and were put on the football teams. Oh yeah, this was a big deal stuff. Well, it so happened Elvis Presley was drafted. And Elvis Presley was assigned to the 10th Infantry Division in Mannheim, I think Mannheim, Germany. And so I said, wow, this is real cool if we can get him to participate in our soldier shows. So I sent somebody down to talk to him. But he surprised everybody and said, "No, I don't want to do anything publicly." He says, I'll do some ad hoc entertainment for my fellow troops here in the division, but I don't want to get involved in any soldier shows." So we approached him a couple of times, and he didn't. So he, when he was on active duty, to his credit, was an excellent soldier. Even though he had all the money, so he had rented a house right outside the main entrance to his barracks, where his girlfriend was placed. So he had her there, right at beck and call. But on the other hand, in my office, one of my clerks was Bing Crosby, one of Bing Crosby's sons, Gary Crosby, who was a real character. He had two other sons, and the other sons were in an armor division. Well, it may have been the other way around. Elvis may have been in the armor division, and the two Crosby twin sons were in the 10th Mountain Division. But their older brother, worked for me. And the main problem with him was he was an enlisted man. He was a specialist, 3rd class, if I recall, Gary. Very full of himself. And he would go to the officers club, and order drinks. And they'd call me and say, your enlisted man is in here. He's not supposed to be here. And I'd go get him and say, Gary, I said, you're not commissioned officers. You cannot go into an officers club. So it was beneath his dignity. I mean, he wanted to do whatever he wanted to do. So finally, I transferred him out and put him into a field unit. But he was not a good soldier like Elvis Presley was, and his younger brothers. So there were a number of well-known people that were in the military service over the years.
now you also mentioned that when you were going over there that somebody had gotten killed.
Yeah, actually, it was just one of those serendipitous things where I was scheduled to be a regimental advisor to the Vietnamese Army. This was the first tour in Vietnam in 61, 62. And when I arrived there, I was getting my field equipment and my weapons, and I was scheduled to leave the next day on an otter for this regiment. And the Assistant Secretary of the General Staff of the MAG headquarters had come down with some type of illness, and he was evacuated as an emergency evacuee. So they needed a replacement. So they looked to see who had just arrived in country, and that included me. And I had been a Secretary of the General Staff at Fort Jackson, excuse me, South Carolina. So they called me up to the headquarters and said they were offering me this position, and that I wanted. So I asked, well, how long was the tour? And they said, well, field tour, if I'd continue with the advisory position in the regiment, that would be 12 months. And if I opted to stay in the headquarters, it would be 13 months. Well, I opted to stay in the headquarters. I found out 2 weeks after I had assumed the Assistant Secretary of the General Staff position in the MAG headquarters that the officer who then replaced me as a senior advisor, the regiment was going through a sweep in a heavily controlled area by the enemy and got killed. So, but for the grace of God, there go you know what. So it was an interesting experience. I was lucky. There was one other incident that I think was interesting. As the war started getting a little heavier, they decided that the MAG was not fully staffed enough to handle a potential arrival of combat troops, even though it wasn't exactly approved, but they thought it was going to be approved to bring some combat troops in. So they selected a commanding general whose name was General Paul Harkins, four-star general who in World War II was one of George Patton's combat commanders. The weekend that General Harkins arrived in country, I happened to be the duty officer at the MAG, so I was on duty. So I met him at the airport, brought him back, put him in the hotel that we had set up for him, and brought him to the headquarters. So, I'll never forget this because it was really interesting. He said, and who are the senior advisors, in the provinces? And these were all full colonels, and I gave him all the names, and he apparently knew one of them. He said, well, can you contact Colonel so-and-so? And I said, I'll try. I said, but ordinarily, I said, the Vietnamese Army doesn't work on weekends. I said, so therefore our advisors will not be in their respective offices. And he was not happy with this answer and said, don't you know there's a war going on? I said, yes, sir, we know there's a war going on. He said, well, effective immediately, all headquarters will be manned 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, 24/7. I said, yes, sir, I'll make sure that the staff knows this tomorrow. So anyway, he turned out to be the commanding general of MACV, Military Advisory Group Vietnam. They changed from MAG to MACV, and he was the first commander there.
And then that's very interesting. And then after you were done with your second duty, you were speaking.
Yeah. Well, actually, I'm trying to remember the names now of the indigenous people who lived in the highlands in near Pleiku in central Vietnam. I'll think of their
You
names.
can just say there were indigenous
Yeah.
people.
And these individuals used crossbows, and they had been there for, I don't know, thousands of years, I guess, historically. And sometimes they would lie on their back, and they knew a lot of American helicopters were flying over their jungle areas, and they would fire the crossbows directly up at the helicopters, and accidentally, even though they were trying to do it, there was no way they could do it precisely, but accidentally, an arrow would get into the rotors of helicopters and down the helicopters. So I remember at least 2 occasions where some of our helicopters, were down by these indigenous individuals. So wartime is a very interesting place. You never know what's going to happen. And I wasn't a real stern disciplinarian, like you hear about, the military guys. For example, when I found out which of my GIs in Vietnam, were doing marijuana, instead of them stopping marijuana because I said so, I said, I know everybody always has a joint. I said, but the people that work for me, I want to be clean. That's because I want you to know what you're doing all the time. I said, so if you want to wear one of those little cord wrist things, or if you want to put a fancy bandana around your neck, or if you want to put a band around your head, I said, fine. I said, but don't smoke Mary Jane. I said, because otherwise you'll get in trouble with me. So they did. So one time, one of my bosses above me said, he says, your troops are looking kind of relaxed and ragged. I said, what do you mean ragged? He said, well, they've got all these funny things on their uniform. I said, that's how I keep them straight and clean. Oh, he said, okay. That's how I got the gold watch in Korea, remember? From the boys. It was common knowledge in the 1960 and the 61, 62 that the CIA had some activity there in the Vietnam operations. One of my roommates during that period of time was a special operations individual whom I kind of always thought was probably associated with the CIA, but I never really knew because obviously it wasn't anything he could talk about. But periodically he was gone for a couple of weeks, and he'd say, well, I'll be back in 2 weeks. I got a few things to do. And I always assumed he was going on some special ops mission someplace behind the enemy lines, because we were involved with the indigenous people, and he always carried a lot of cash with him, and we knew what cash could do in Vietnam. So anyway, this one time he was gone for a couple of weeks, and then he was. I asked somebody. I said, "Where's Pete?" They said, well, we think he's still gone. Well, then he was gone just an inordinate length of time. So I finally found somebody that said, oh, he's in the hospital. I said, in the hospital? What's he doing in the hospital? Oh, he had a little mishap. So I went down to see him in the small hospital that we had there. And I said, what happened? And he had a gash in his leg. And he was a parachutist. So he had parachuted behind, he didn't tell me all the particulars, but enough, behind the enemy lines. And and landed on a herd of water buffalo. And one of the horns of the water buffalo gouged his thigh. He was very embarrassed, coming down in the wrong place. So old Pete took him a while to get healed. But he had a lot of French friends and spoke fluent French. So on the weekends, we generally went, he had a big Citroën, which was part of his cover, I guess. And so we would go down to Cap Saint-Jacques, which was the French, kind of the French Riviera in southern Vietnam. The Vietnamese renamed it their old name Phuong Thao, which is a port city. But Cap Saint-Jacques was the way the French named it. And we would be driving down this coastal road, and we knew generally where it would happen, but the Viet Cong would come up out of the bushes and stop the vehicle. It was one of their roadblocks. And the idea was to get money. So you had to empty your pockets of all the piastres, the Vietnamese money that you had. And of course I was an American, so I had to keep my mouth shut. But I looked French. I had a real deep suntan then. I wore French clothes, French shirts, and so I bought my clothes, in French shops. So I just kept my mouth shut and gave my money over. But that was one of the things they did, not just on the road, but in Saigon. They knew where the French restaurants were. And periodically, the Viet Cong would go into the restaurant, find the manager, and most of them were women, who were owners and managers, to get money. And if you were there as a guest, having your dinner, she came around, to get a donation from everybody there to increase her little pot. So that I got stuck with that a few times too. So we knew the Viet Cong were right there in town. And what they did on a number of occasions, just to frighten people. And we learned when you're in a French restaurant, you want to sit as far back from the front door as possible with your back against the wall. And when the Viet Cong would come in, they would have a hand grenade. And they would take the hand grenade and they would roll it on the floor toward the rear of the restaurant to get as many people as possible. But they had emptied almost all of the black gunpowder out of the hand grenade. And they left just enough in it that when it exploded, it would just pop and make a little tiny crack in the serrated edges of the hand grenade. So it didn't hurt anybody, but scared the hell out of you. You didn't know. So this could be the one that was real, and didn't have the powder out. So that happened to me a couple times. So that was a little scary. So I was in the Pentagon, in OPO, Office of Personnel Operations, and in Deputy Chief of Staff for Logistics, DESLOG, the Army General Staff. Those are my 2 tours in the Pentagon.
Okay. So, can you talk about OPO, what their mission was?
Yeah. It was like the office, any Office of Personnel Management. It was like all assignments were done. They had the officer assignments, enlisted assignments. That includes selection for schools, typical personnel management functions.
And what was your role specifically?
Well, in OPO, in Office of Personnel Management, I was in the Personnel Services Division in the MOS Control Branch. I was a branch chief, and I was the one that inputted people into training schools and made sure I had the correct number of military occupational specialty. Like riflemen had a number. Let's say a rifleman, I don't remember the number, but let's say it was like his MOS, military occupational specialty, is 210. For example, as an infantry platoon leader, my MOS as an officer was 1542. So to input people into officer candidate school or into the military, well, not the military, but to keep track of who's in the military academy and who is in ROTC programs in colleges, universities. This was all data that came through OPO. So we had all that information. So it was basically a personnel management dealing with people and numbers.
It was kind of like balancing the budget with the resources needed.
Exactly.
And so were you involved in picking and choosing, or were you involved in overseeing?
No, I was involved in establishing the requirements. I would say in the next 120 days, we need to have 1,231 MOS 710. That would go to a training division. They would survey all of the military schools or contract schools, and they would input students into classes, so they would be graduating at the time when I needed to fill the positions. So it was a matter of coordinating all this stuff.
That is a logistic.
It is logistics, exactly.
Yeah, and what basis were you like, if there was to be a mission coming up where they knew, like I'm suspecting you had top secret
Yes.
information, and you were,
Yes.
the thrust of my question is, what did you base that decision on? Is it from intelligence you were getting?
Oh, no, it was, see, the Army, of course now it's all computerized, but in those days it was actually done by statisticians, I used to call them, with the rubber armbands, to keep your sleeves up, and the green eye shades. These were statisticians. I had an office full of them, and they evaluated these reports that came in from around the world every day. So we knew that for this military occupational specialty, that we needed 100 people 6 months from now. And so then I had to establish requirements for service schools to make sure that we had people input in the courses. Now, the service school may come back and say, our classes are full. So then I would have to contact another directorate that was involved in providing budgetary funds for the service school so they could add some new classes for this period of time. So it was a coordination type of thing.
Yeah, you had have a lot of vision.
Oh,
foresight.
yeah, and you had to know what, for example, and then this is an interesting one. I was told that air traffic controllers, who were always men, were coming in short supply. And this was the beginning of when the WACs were kind of showing more responsibility, and we were getting more in the service. And I said, well, why not put women in as an air traffic controller? So I called my people together, and we contacted our air traffic control schools. The major one was in Biloxi, Mississippi. And I said, how about if we input some women into your air traffic course? Oh, no, we can't do that. I said, why can't you do that? Well, because, we only have one bathroom, and we don't, and we're worried about, putting the guys and the girls together at night, in this isolated thing. I said, hey, these are all, intelligent people. I said, and they can be oriented and told, what's right and what's wrong. I said, and so let's try it. So I finally twisted their arm enough where they said, okay, we'll do it. So I inputted 3 young women into the air traffic school at Biloxi, Mississippi. Guess how they graduated? 1, 2, 3 in the class. So from then on, it was not a question. I said, I said, the barracks, you know, we're putting uniformed women and uniformed men in the same barracks. You know, we put one on the second floor and the other group on the first floor. I said, why can't we do this with the air traffic controller? Well, anyway, we did, and it's joint. So they've been doing it ever since. And this was during that period of time. In all candor, the deputy commanding general of 2 field forces was an old friend of mine, and he was a brigadier general. And he kept saying to me, Bob, come on with me when I go over to Cambodia, you know, tomorrow morning. He says, I know you know how to shoot. He said, and, you know, you just might pick up a medal for heroism. I mean, this is done in the military. I wasn't interested in that.
The gentlemen and women who earned those only were able to go and do what they do because of the paths and the job that you did. Can you talk about what that means to you, what your job and what you did for them?
Yeah, I mean, Linda knows because I've said this to her a number of times. Being in the Army was a job for me. I mean, it was a career. It wasn't, you know, I wasn't doing it because I, you know, was gung-ho or, you know, super patriotic and all that stuff. You know, in fact, when I was stationed at Fort Dix, New Jersey in the 9th Division, I lived in a house in a little town called Vincenttown, which was about 10 miles from the base. People who lived in that neighborhood never knew I was in the service. So when I came home at night, I took my uniform off, put my civilian clothes on, and every now and then somebody would say, well, what do you do for a living? It was important, and I wanted to do the best job I could.
You were the Safeguard Systems Officer of the Office Chief of Staff in the Army. What were your duties in Rosalind, Virginia?
So I was in the Pentagon, in OPO, Office of Personnel Operations, and in Deputy Chief of Staff for Logistics, DESLOG, the Army General Staff. Those were my 2 tours in the Pentagon.
Okay. So what was can you talk about OPO, what their mission was?
Yeah. It was like the office, any Office of Personnel Management. It was like all assignments were done, the officer assignments, enlisted assignments. That includes selection for schools, typical personnel management functions.
And what was your role specifically?
Well, in OPO, in Office of Personnel Management, I was in the Personnel Services Division in the MOS Control Branch. I was a branch chief, and I was the one that inputted people into training schools and made sure I had the correct number of military occupational specialty. Like riflemen had a number. Let's say a rifleman, I don't remember the number, but let's say it was like his MOS, military occupational specialty, is 210. For example, as an infantry platoon leader, my MOS as an officer was 1542. So to input people into officer candidate school or into the military, well, not the military, but to keep track of who's in the military academy and who is in ROTC programs in colleges, universities. This was all data that came through OPO. So we had all that information. So it was basically a personnel management dealing with people and numbers.
It was kind of like balancing the budget with the resources needed.
Exactly.
And so were you involved in picking and choosing, or were you involved in overseeing?
No, I was involved in establishing the requirements. I would say in the next 120 days, we need to have 1,231 MOS 710. that would go to a training division. They would survey all of the military schools or contract schools, and they would input students into classes, so they would be graduating at the time when I needed to fill the positions. So it was a matter of coordinating all this stuff.
That is a logistic.
It is logistics, exactly.
Yeah, and what basis were you like, if there was to be a mission coming up where they knew, like, I'm suspecting you had top secret
Yes.
information, and you were,
Yes.
the thrust of my question is, what did you base that decision on? Is it from intelligence you were getting?
Oh, no, it was, see, the Army, of course now it's all computerized, but in those days it was actually done by statisticians, I used to call them, with the rubber armbands, to keep your sleeves up, and the green eye shades. These were statisticians. I had an office full of them, and they evaluated these reports that came in from around the world every day. So we knew that for this military occupational specialty, that we needed 100 people 6 months from now. And so then I had to establish requirements for service schools to make sure that we had people input into courses. Now, the service school may come back and say, our classes are full. So then I would have to contact another directorate that was involved in providing budgetary funds for the service school so they could add some new classes for this period of time. So it was a coordination type of thing.
Yeah, you had have a lot of vision.
Oh,
foresight.
yeah, and you had to know what, for example, and then this is an interesting one. I was told that air traffic controllers, who were always men, were coming in short supply. And this was the beginning of when the WACs were kind of showing more responsibility, and we were getting more in the service. And I said, well, why not put women in as an air traffic controller? So I called my people together, and we contacted our air traffic control schools. The major one was in Biloxi, Mississippi. And I said, how about if we input some women into your air traffic course? Oh no, we can't do that. I said, why can't you do that? Well, because we only have one bathroom, and we don't, and we're worried about putting the guys and the girls together at night, in this isolated thing. I said, hey, these are all intelligent people. I said, and they can be oriented and told what's right and what's wrong. I said, and so let's try it. So I finally twisted their arm enough where they said, okay, we'll do it. So I inputted 3 young women into the air traffic school at Biloxi, Mississippi. Guess how they graduated? 1, 2, 3 in the class. So from then on, it was not a question. I said, the barracks, we're putting uniformed women and uniformed men in the same barracks. We put one on the second floor and the other group on the first floor. I said, why can't we do this with the air traffic controller? Well, anyway, we did, and it's joint. So they've been doing it ever since. And this was during that period of time.
It's fantastic. You've done a lot of firsts.
Yeah.
You implemented a lot of things that people hadn't been done.
Well, you got to take a chance on things sometimes. You have to think it through, and then you make a decision. Sometimes you're wrong. I mean, I was wrong on a few occasions, but I don't remember conveniently when I was
Well,
wrong.
Bob, wasn't one of your jobs at the Pentagon with war games too? Or possibilities if such and such happened in this
If
country?
Oh,
And then after Korea, Vietnam, did you ever go back to either Korea or Vietnam?
yeah, actually,
Many years later?
and it was through Linda. She had seen something in one of my magazines. I think it was the Armed Forces, the Retired Officers magazine, which I get. And the Korean government has had a program since the Korean War, where if you were in the Korean War directly, or if you were in any of the occupation periods of time, they invited you to come to Korea for 7 days, put you up in a 5-star hotel as a guest of the government, and celebrate your contribution to them being a free country. Remember, we did save, the United Nations, we're the largest of the group, saved South Korea from annihilation by the North Koreans and the Chinese. In fact, there was a Chinese story I really wanted to remember.
I'll remind you.
But so what happened was they also invited the family. And so we made our flight arrangements, bought our tickets, in fact, on Korean Airlines, flew to Korea, and they put us up in this beautiful hotel. And I think there were about 4 of us who were actual Korean veterans of the war. The rest of them were veterans of occupation in Korea after the war. And some of them had their grandchildren with them. Some of them, had families. Some of them came alone. A couple of them, of the original ones, one was a Marine that was actually in really, really serious combat, during the Korean War. And he gave a little spiel. I was lucky because I was one of the senior ones. It happened to be United Nations Day there in South Korea, so we went to the United Nations cemetery, and I was able to present a wreath on behalf of the American soldiers that participated in the Korean War. And it was not only a wreath, but it was what's the material that you have aroma from, that you light up?
Incense.
Incense. It was a big Korean, pot that had the incense in it, and I was able to add incense to that.
What's the significance of incense?
Well, it's an honorific thing in the Far East, where they commemorate a lot of very, very nice holidays or important holidays with incense. That's just part of their custom. So
How did it smell?
yeah, so
Remember
it was
smelling
good.
it?
Oh, well, you can smell it. Oh, sure, because there was a lot of it, and then I was able to present the. So we went to the United Nations Cemetery, and people, gave nice speeches, and so it was really interesting.
Commendation medal with 4 oak leaves. Those are the Monopoly.
That's the green one. Yeah, that's the one, undetected crime.
And 4 oak leaves, or 4 OLCs.
Yeah, which means I got it 5 times.
Okay. Was that common to get it 5 times?
No, not really.
That's pretty
I was an efficient officer. That's what I got.
kidding. Kidding.
All modesty thrown aside.
Let's be honest. It's time. 91.
Yeah, there is a pinning ceremony, and depends on where you are, and usually the commander, gives it to you. Like the Legion of Merit was presented to me by the general who ran Safeguard, who was a 3-star general. Well, you also when you get promoted, usually the highest ranking officer pins the medal on you. So most of mine were done by generals or by full colonels, you know, who were either chiefs of staff or whatever.
So what does that mean when you see another service member wearing some, you know?
Depends on what they're wearing. I mean, the ones that wear the Distinguished Service Medal, the ones that and the ones that wear the Silver Star, the ones that wear the Bronze Star Medal with V device, these are all for heroism. I don't have any for heroism because I was not in frontline combat, so therefore I didn't have the opportunity, even though in all candor, the deputy commanding general of 2 field forces was an old friend of mine, and he was a brigadier general. And he kept saying to me, Bob, come on with me when I go over to Cambodia, you know, tomorrow morning. He says, I know you know how to shoot. He said, and, you know, you just might pick up a medal for heroism. I mean, this is done in the military. I wasn't interested in that.
A second. So when your daughters were born, did your perspective change? I know.
I had a more unusual situation. Their mother had 4 other children by a previous marriage. So I ended up with 6 children, not just 2. So I used to I had to buy a bigger house, refer to my abode as Carroll Hotel. So anyway, without getting into any details, it was a pretty,
Did you feel more pressure then?
I felt a lot more pressure.
Did you look at the world at all different?
No, my job was my job, my family was
How
another
do you
job.
do that?
another
How do you
job.
separate? You seem to be able
People
to
compartmentalize. People know how to Some
how?
people know how to compartmentalize. You don't let one thing impact too much on the other.
Do you feel that's a significant success trait of yours?
Oh, maybe.
What other ones?
Yeah. I'm as Linda will agree.